Right now we want to talk a little bit about palettes and creating color palettes. Color palettes are the basis for everything on the NES. As you saw in the first video, if I go to test and export, I don't see anything because what we have is nothing but gray palettes for every palette that is exported. So my start screen has nothing but gray. However, if I go to debug and I go to PPU viewer, this is the picture processing unit viewer, I can see what values the NES has actually loaded. Unlike a modern tool, the NES isn't actually loading bitmap graphics. It's not actually loading graphics the way that we think of it in terms of games today. It's loading small files with lots of bytes of data that represent these different slots, these different color slots, and I call each collection of these slots a sub palette. So this first row of colors here, this is the background tile sub palette, and the second row, this first row is the sprite sub palette, and the second row is the background palette, background color sub palettes. So what you're going to see here is all the values that are loaded for the background. With the NES, each 16 by 16 pixel tile area for the backgrounds has to use only one of these sub palettes. So you can't mix and match colors within these sub palettes. You are stuck, you're regimented to one sub palette per tile. For sprites, it's the same, but it's an 8 by 8 pixel area. This first color in each of these sub palettes is always the same. This is the transparent color. In sprites, it simply doesn't show up. In tiles, that color shows up, but it's the same no matter which sub palette you're using. We usually use it for as black as the background. If you're making a platform game, you might use like light blue for a sky color, since that's sort of your base color. So that's a little bit of info. There's a lot more info out there about how NES handles color, but I just wanted to show you where you could look to see what's currently loaded. Currently, we use this sub palette right here for our HUD, for our heads-up displays. This is the sub palette that's always used, giving us this much play as far as colors per screen. So if we take a look at our project here, our empty project, if I go to Pallets, I have a folder called Pallets, and I have 64 possible palettes that I can use from palette 0 to palette 63 for background tiles. You might start to run out, but that is a lot of palettes if you're clever about the way you design graphics. For 256 screens, that's one palette for every 4 screens or something like that. So and there's only 56 colors, I believe, that the NES can reproduce. So what you want to do in order to assign palettes is to edit palettes. You can just click right on it, and you can actually start making these modifications right here. You can right click on a color and choose the color. Now, the first color in the group is that one that I said is always the same across sub palettes. That's why in this case it automatically all went to black. And then these others, this might be the first sub palette. So this would be green and brown and blue. So this might be for a forest, and we've got grass and trees, dead trees and water. And then we've also on that same screen have grass and 2 tones of stone or metal or something. And then we've also got grass, and maybe we've got 2 tones of brown here for a house or something like that, log cabin. And then we've got the HUD tile. So we also have what's outputting as a night palette, and this doesn't necessarily mean night palette. Just like above ground and underground doesn't really necessarily mean that. It literally just means 2 different maps. This is just 2 different palettes that are inextricably linked. This is getting out, the index for this is getting output to a certain place, and this index is exactly the same, but it's going to a different table. So for instance, if you're on screen 27 and it's daytime, it might load 27 index, which is this one, or 27 night index, which is this one. And you don't have to make use of these at all, or you can, and you don't necessarily have to link them by day and night, and then you can extend the amount of palettes you have to 128 palettes. So that's a lot of palette data, and that's just for the background tiles. So now that we have this palette 0 here, I want to rename this. I can right click on it, rename it as grassland palette. I can name it anything I want, and I can't use that yet in a game unless I put it in a palette group. So I'm going to right click on palette groups, add a palette group, and when you see a plus sign here, it means that there's more information. If I click on the plus sign, that more information pops up. If I hit the minus sign, it minimizes it. I'll call this main gameplay palettes, or whatever you want to call it. And in order to put this into there, I can right click, assign this palette to group to main gameplay palettes, and you can see I now have my main gameplay palettes in there. I could also export and import, which is basically like copying and pasting that. I'll rename this to Grassland Palette 2, and maybe this palette is virtually the same, except we don't have houses in this one. We have apple trees, which require a dark green for their leaves and the red for the apples. And I also want this one in my main gameplay palette, so I'll assign this to main gameplay palettes. And then if I wanted another group, I might have dungeon palettes, and I could make more palettes to put inside the dungeon palette. So that's one way that you can start creating palettes, is just sort of think out the colors that you want to use for your tiles. But sometimes you are creating graphics, and as you create is when you want to be building your palettes. So one way that you can do that, let's say that I know that none of this is going to represent the tiles that I want to create. I can take another palette, and let's call this test palette for now. And I'm going to take test palette, an empty test palette, and I'm going to put it into my main gameplay palettes, because I know it's going to be part of my main game when I'm done. I just don't have anything there yet. So now if I'm in my pixel editor, and we're going to look at this in a second, and I'm looking at a tile, I can load up that test palette. And this is another place where I can start to edit palettes. So for instance, I have a completely blank palette here. If I start to draw, or if I start to look at a graphic through here, I can start to assign what colors it's going to use here. And as I make changes here, those changes will be reflected over here. And you can see those changes being reflected here. Now sometimes you have to click on a value in order to get it to actually update in this little hierarchy. It's still saving here, whether you see that reflected here or not. So another way that I can affect palettes is actually while I'm working with the palettes. Just like if I'm in assets and I'm working on making a new tile that I could apply to a screen, I can start messing with the colors here. So for instance, let's say I don't like this color green in my grassland palette anymore. I've got my main gameplay palettes and my grassland palette loaded, and maybe I want this darker color green to represent my grass. And now those changes are being affected here and here. So wherever you see these palette interfaces, you can affect change to the colors. Incidentally, that might be why you may want to make a palette group called Temp Palettes or Dummy Palettes or something like that, and just go ahead and go to the very bottom of the screen and rename this one Temp Palette and assign that to that group. This way, if you're looking at a screen or you're editing a new graphic and you don't want to manipulate these, but you want to see a new color set as you're creating, you can go to Temp Palettes and load up this temporary palette, and it's going to affect this, not accidentally affect one of your main palettes that you've actually already decided on. So now I can make a temporary palette. Let's say, yeah, I'm working on a lava area right now, so I need these reds, and now I can start drawing this lava area. I didn't affect this, but I did affect this one here. But who cares? I can remember that the last palette in the group is the test palette, and if I start to run out, then I could just be very conscious about creating the palette. Anyway, if you really want to see the image of what colors that palette has, all you have to do right now is just right click and just reselect, and it will automatically update the little icon to reflect all the colors that you've currently selected in that palette. So that's for tile palettes, and the monster palettes work very similarly. So you'll see monster palettes right here. And this is all the monster palettes that are loaded right now. And you can name them, you can import and export palettes. But for monster palettes, you really are affecting them at the monster level. So when you're creating monsters or you're working with objects, for instance, if I was working with game objects, this is where I'm affecting these monster palettes. So I would select this, I might give it a name like player palette, and then I could change the colors. These don't mix. So the monster palettes are completely separate from the background palettes. You have 63 or 64 monster palettes, and you have 64 tile palettes, and they're separate. So that's 128 palettes altogether. So that's a quick look at palettes and how to organize them, how to group them, and how to change them, and some best practices as far as creating temp or dummy palettes.